السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان يوم الدين أما بعد. So alhamdulillah, inshallah, after like a long journey with the story of Musa alayhi salam, we're hopefully inshallah concluding tonight. So today I was hoping to kind of conclude with almost 3 stories. So there's one story that we haven't really, or 2 stories that are essentially mentioned in the Quran that we haven't really addressed. One of them is within the time frame of Musa alayhi salam and Harun, and the other one is right after, perhaps a little bit after their lifetime of Musa and Harun alayhi salam. And so today we're going to talk about those 2 stories, and in between them is the death of Harun and Musa alayhi salam. So does anybody know which story I'm talking about? There's one prominent story that's always mentioned. Ashab al-Sabt, that's one of them. It is after Musa. There's one story that's always mentioned. Well, no, it's not mentioned in Baqarah. So there's 2 more stories that are usually mentioned in the Quran. One of them is Ashab al-Sabt, that we haven't talked through the journey of Musa alayhi salam. The other one has to do with an individual. Huh? Who? No. Samiri we discussed. Qarun. Have we mentioned Qarun? We have not mentioned Qarun at all. Right? So the first one we're going to talk about today is Qarun from Bani Israel. And then we're going to move into the death of Harun and Musa alayhi salam, and then Ashab al-Sabt. You have a question, Sheikh? Yes. What did I say? I said Bani Israel, right? Haman is with Wazir Fir'aun. There's no يعني ابني لي صرح لعلي أبلغ الأسباب. خلاص Fir'aun is dead. We're done with him. We moved on, alhamdulillah. طيب. So Qarun, one thing before we kind of mention, before we go on, these figures that we mention in the Quran, or the figures that are mentioned in the Quran, we have to understand they're not just individuals, but they're also symbolic to the type of people. Right? So these individuals that we mention, they're also symbolic to types of people, because quite often people, like these individuals, they classify certain types, and human beings will be classified, or they tend to have tendencies towards some of those different types of individuals. So for example, so these are the 3 types of, I guess you can say, antagonists, right? Antagonists to Musa alayhi salam. 3 types of individuals. The first one was Fir'aun, which is the classical tyrant, right? The one with power and might and kingdomship. So that is the personification of Fir'aun. And anybody who ever is in that position, who becomes a tyrant because of the power that they have, of whatever limited power, doesn't matter. They practice tyranny in the capacity that they have. That is pretty much like Fir'aun. And then you have the story of a Samiri. This essentially is more of the type of people who are like hypocrites, right? They're hypocrites. Essentially, there is something that is external. They claim to be Muslims, but inherently there is some disbelief in there, or they tend to practice things that deviate from their religion. So those are examples of the hypocrites. And the last one is Qarun, the one we're going to talk about today, who essentially is an individual, any individual whose wealth, make him into an individual that crosses boundaries, right? You think because you have wealth that you are free to do whatever you want, or you have the ability and capability to cross boundaries or oppress others or be arrogant, or whatever the case is, right? So those are the 3 kind of, antagonists that were against Musa alayhi salam, or that he faced. So the question is, was Qarun before Musa had left Egypt, or after he left Egypt? So I'm going to go with the theory, and I'm going to mention why, that it is after he left Egypt. No, no, he didn't drown. Qarun did not drown. Yeah, Sheikh, we name a lot of things in Egypt. They're not necessarily because people were there, right? No, no, he did not drown in Egypt. His punishment was he did not drown. The earth swallowed him. That was his punishment. But we'll talk about it essentially when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Qarun. He said, إِنَّ قَارُونَ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمِ مُوسَى فَبَغَى عَلَيْهِمْ. That Qarun was from the Qawm Musa, the people of Musa. And the people of Musa are Bani Israel. طيب. Why didn't he say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, إِنَّ قَارُونَ كَانَ مِنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل? It's true, right? The statement is still correct. But Allah A'lam, it is to show that actually that there was a closer link between Qarun and Musa alayhi salam. That there was a closer link between Qarun and Musa alayhi salam. It was mentioned that, in fact, that he was his cousin, like as close as being the cousin of Musa alayhi salam, maternal cousin, right? Ibn Khala. So it was mentioned that he was that close. So he isn't just any individual, but he was actually close to Musa alayhi salam. And when he mentioned that he was from qawmi min qawmi Musa, and so essentially he was there during the time of Musa alayhi salam as a prophet, which also based on that it indicates that he has experienced what Bani Israel had experienced. So the reason I'm saying he was after Musa alayhi salam is because the Coptics never allowed anybody from Bani Israel to possess any sort of material gains. They never allowed him to possess some sort of material gains. And so essentially he was essentially he was oppressed similar like the Bani Israel. And he experienced the hardship that the Bani Israel had experienced, but also witnessed the miracles that Musa alayhi salam had performed in front of him. However, his problem was that after, he was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rescued him with Bani Israel and so forth, but it seemed that he was able to gain some sort of wealth, right? Was able to gain some sort of wealth. Allah blessed him one way or another. But rather than, building on that experience of oppression that he felt with Bani Israel, rather than try to alleviate them with the wealth that he had and utilize the wealth he had, instead what he did was, he actually utilized it to oppress Bani Israel. فَبَغَى عَلَى قَوْمِهِ. Right? Bagha, which means he transgressed upon his people. So essentially this is what Qarun had done. And if you look at the story of Qarun, his people essentially when they saw him, they tried to advise him with a few things. And this is from Surah Al-Qasas, and it's a Meccan surah. والله سبحانه وتعالى said إن قارون كان من قوم موسى فبغى عليهم وآتيناه من الكنوز ما إن مفاتحه لتنوء بالعصبة أولي القوة إذ قال له قومه لا تفرح إن الله لا يحب الفرحين. So that is the first advice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing Qarun. Right? He said Qarun is from the people of Musa alayhi salam, but ولكن بغى عليهم, but he essentially oppressed them. He was a tyrant. He tyrannized them. وآتيناه من الكنوز, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and we gave him from the treasures ما إن مفاتحه, that تنوء به العصبة, that the number of keys that he had for the treasuries that he had, or he had to essentially to protect his belongings, whatever the case is. There's so much that the group of people, it would be heavy for them to carry. Al-Usba is like a group of band of people, like anywhere between 3 to 10 individuals, or 7 to 10, wallahu alam. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this, and so 7 to 10 people would carry them. And as I mentioned, the scholars had mentioned that Qarun was the cousin of Musa alayhi salam. So however, rather than thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessings that he have and utilizing it to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he did, and essentially we have to understand that wealth is a form of test, is that he failed this test, right? And rather used it in ways that would displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It made him essentially actually arrogant and feel that he's independent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in fact that he only gained it or he has it because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was pleased with him, which means he translated that I have this wealth, Allah gave it to me because he is pleased with me, which is not necessarily true as we go through this inshallah. And so his people tried to advise him. He said لا تفرح إن الله لا يحب الفرحين. So they gave him 5 advices. Right? The first one, they said لا تفرح. لا تفرح, which I guess is usually most likely translated is don't exalt, right? Don't exalt. إن الله لا يحب الفرحين. Allah does not like the one who are exultant. So some people, farah over here is related to joy a little bit, but this is not what they are telling him. They're not telling him don't be happy with what Allah gave you, right? What they're talking about is a prohibited form of joy, which over here is usually associated with being overly happy with worldly gains to the point that you're completely engrossed in it. Like you're completely, just into it whatsoever, resulting you to forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forgetting about the hereafter. This is the type of overjoy that is considered prohibited, right? It's not the joy that Allah blessed you with something, but it's the one that you just, you're just happy because you have worldly gains and you're overly joyed with it, that it completely brainwashes you, that you forget your purpose on this earth, you forget that you have a creator, you forget that you're going to die, you forget there's a hereafter. And so they told him, don't exalt, be careful, right? So they're telling him, be careful, there is a middle ground, right? Be happy with what you have, but not overly exalted that you forget the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the first advice. The second advice is we said, وَابْتَغِ فِيمَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ وَابْتَغِ فِيمَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ, and seek through which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the hereafter. الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ, which is your home in the hereafter. So they're advising him essentially to utilize what he has to build the hereafter, right? Now this indicates obviously, like Qarun was like Bani Israel. He believed in the hereafter. Otherwise, this advice would make no sense. So he was a Muslim among the Muslims, and so they were advising him of how to deal with his wealth and to use that wealth that he had from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by utilizing it in a means that would draw him closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would make Allah pleased with him, so he'd build in the hereafter. So that is the second advice they gave him. The third, they said, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنْ الدُّنْيَا. وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنْ الدُّنْيا. And while you're doing this, do not forget your share of this world. So what does that mean? So essentially they're telling him, they're telling him you're not commanded to use all your wealth and give it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not saying that. They're trying to direct him to that middle ground. They say, yes, give in charity, do your due diligence to fulfill the rights of that wealth, but also spend some of it for yourself, right? Enjoy life with it also, right? وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيا, in a lawful way, obviously, right? We're not saying in an unlawful way, in an impermissible way, but it has to always be done in permissible ways, because we have to understand. So the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that on the Day of Judgment, we will always be asked about several things. Our feet will not move on the Day of Judgment unless we're questioned about four things. One of them is about our wealth, where we acquired it from and how we spent it. Right? And so spending our wealth is something that we will be questioned about. And part of expressing our thankfulness and gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that we never utilize this wealth in ways that would displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the basics of being thankful, right? Expressing gratitude means that you utilize it in a way that would please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He gave it to you. This is exactly similar to whenever we gift, for example, if we gift our children something and then they use it to do something that would displease us or something that is wrong. For example, you give them a phone, right? And then they use this phone to do things that are, not correct. What do? You take it away from them, right? You say, you don't deserve this. I gave you this as a tool. I trusted you. You betrayed my trust. So similarly, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us any sort of bounty, part of expressing thanks and gratitude means that we utilize it in ways that please Him. And that includes everything, by the way. It's not just wealth. It is our sights, for example, our strength, our limbs. All these things are blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What do we utilize them in? Do we utilize them in a way that will bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or do we do the opposite, right? Do we utilize them in things that would move us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so this was this was the advice that they gave him. And so to not forget his share from the hereafter, right? But this advice also implies another aspect, which is do not be excessively engrossed in seeking the dunya, right? To the extent that you have no chance to enjoy. Sorry. Yes, that's true, right? Don't be excessively engrossed in seeking the dunya. Like you're working, you're just accumulating, you're accumulating, you're accumulating, right? And you don't have a chance to enjoy what you accumulated. Quite often, sometimes we fall into this trap, the whole rat race, right? You wake up in the morning, you work, you're trying to acquire money and wealth to build your future, but 20 years later, 30 years later, you realize I haven't enjoyed what I have, right? My family have enjoyed it, but I haven't enjoyed any of it. And I guess this is where people go through the midlife crisis. It's not a midlife crisis. People realize I've worked enough for everybody. I want to take care of myself, right? And so they start spending it on themselves. And so they behave in ways that people think, subhanAllah, this is a midlife crisis. Why is he buying a fancy car? Why are they getting a motorcycle? Why are they doing these things? No, they're just essentially they're realizing I spent 30 years working and working, accumulating money, and giving it to my family members. I haven't had a chance to enjoy it. I'm going to enjoy it now. Right? That's what it is. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. The fourth advice, وابتغ فيما آتاك الله الدار الآخرة وأحسن كما أحسن الله إليك وأحسن كما أحسن الله إليك, and do good as Allah has done good to you. Right? وأحسن كما أحسن الله. And so essentially they're telling him, be good and generous to the servants of Allah and to His creation, similar to how subhanahu wa ta'ala has been good and generous to you by bestowing all these favors upon you. Right? So essentially they said, وَأَحْسِن كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. So that is the fourth advice. The fifth advice they gave him, they said, وَلَا تَبْغِ فِي الْأَرْضَ فَسَادًا وَلَا تَبْغِ فِي الْأَرْض فَسَادًا. And do not desire corruption. Right? لا تبغي في الأرض. Do not desire corruption in this land. إن الله لا يحب المفسدين. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like the corruptors. So which means that they're telling him, don't let your aim to be to spread corruption on this earth and harm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creations by your arrogance, by your transgressions, by your oppression. And subhanallah, it's quite interesting that you find that most of the time people with wealth, they tend to dedicate that wealth to cause some sort of a corruption, one way or another, right? Yes, there's always people like Uthman ibn Affan. There's always people like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq that utilize their wealth to, bring good into this world. But many people would utilize their wealth on the opposite side, is actually to spread, more corruption. For example, people who they spend from their own money, for example, to, I don't know, build concerts, I guess. I have no idea, right? I'm just trying to think of something. But this is something that they feel that they want to do, but that spreads corruption more than anything else, right? It doesn't spread any sort of goodness. And so we have to be careful not to be among those category that do that. And so those are the 5 advices that they gave Qarun. So what was his response? How did he respond to them when they gave him this advice? أُتِيتُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ عِنْدِي. Right? So essentially what he did was he said, I was only given this because of knowledge I have. إِنَّمَا أُتِيتُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ عِنْدِي. Ibn Kathir, rahimahullah, when he was explaining this, he said essentially Qarun was, what he's saying is, he's saying, I have no need for your advice. Right? I don't need your advice. Allah has only given me this wealth because He knows that I deserve it, and because He loves me, and He knows my virtue. That's what Ibn Kathir said. Right? Quite often people misunderstand, or they think that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them aspects of this world, that He's pleased with them. Right? The interesting thing is the companions were the opposite. Whenever they feel that there was a lot of blessings coming in, they would pause and say, is there something I'm doing wrong? Right? Why? Because there's another verse in the Quran, right? فَلَمَّا نَسُوا مَا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. When they forgot or left what they were ordered with. We opened the gates of everything for them, which means the wealth of this world, right? Hatta, until, right? Until they forgot, they occupied it. أخذناهم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took them, right? All of a sudden. And so this is something they should actually worry about. When things are very good and going well, this is what they call istidraj, right? Istidraj, which means I forgot the best word to translate this in English. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سَنَسْتَدْرِجُهُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Essentially, it's not a good way to describe it. But leading them on, essentially, right? Leading them on. They think that this is good for them, when in reality it's a test, right? It is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this was his response. And then, not just that, he even made things worse by deciding to parade with his entire adornment and show off his wealth, right? So he just, an entire parade of show of wealth. And so once this happened, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the response of people, the Bani Israel. And the response was they divided into two groups, right? They divided into two groups. So one group, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَخَرَجَ عَلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ فِي زِينَتِهِ قَالَ الَّذِينَ يُرِيدُونَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا يَا لَيْتَ لَنَا مِثْلَ قَارُونَ إِنَّهُ لَذُو حَظٍّ عَظِيمٍ. So the first group, right? So this is the first group Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. This first group essentially were individuals that, whose desire and inclination were for this world. Like they had worldly inclinations, desire. And so when they saw Qarun, they said, Ya laytana, we wish we could have the same thing as Utiya Qarun. Innahu ladu hadhin azim. Right? In fact, they said he is extremely fortunate. Like, what is this fortune? Like, he's extremely fortunate. And so those individuals essentially only looked at the outside of things, the shell. They looked at the shell and the outward appearance. That's it. طيب. The second group of people, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in the Quran, he said, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمِ, right? وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمِ وَيْلَكُمْ ثَوَابُ اللَّهِ خَيْرٌ لِمَنْ آمَنَ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا وَلَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا الصَّابِرُونَ. And so the second group of individuals, those who actually have knowledge, right? Second people who are, those are people of knowledge and insight to the reality and purpose of this world, right? They understand the reality of things. They go beyond just the surface. They go just being mesmerized by this world. And so they said that the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is better. The reward of Allah is better, meaning the immediate reward of Allah, right? The enjoyment of and love of worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, turning to Him in all our affairs and so forth, right? This is what is better, right? And the latter reward also, which is paradise, Jannah, that is a lot better than all these things that you see, right? Dar al-akhirah. So once, these were the two groups that existed, right? Ones that were mesmerized by the outside, right? And this is something we quite often fall into. We get mesmerized, mashallah, look at this, right? But we never know what the inside is like. And especially now we live in a world that essentially the default is that they post, right? Or they put forth what is essentially the best of everything, even if they have to fake it, right? People don't realize what's truly in the inside. And so they think, mashallah, we see from the outside that it must be good for everything else. But the people of knowledge know that it's not something like that. And so what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did was, He said, فَخَسَفْنَا بِهِ وَبِدَارِهِ, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, essentially what He did was He destroyed Qarun, right? He destroyed Qarun. And so when Qarun reached that state of conceit, right? That the epitome of that conceit and pride in himself and his adornments, and he was arrogant towards the people of Bani Israel, and he transgressed against them, and then the torment and punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came in response, right? Torment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came in response, and essentially him and his belongings and his treasures and his house were essentially swallowed in this earth, right? And it's interesting the people who reacted, the people who desired this world. Once this happened, they said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَصْبَحَ الَّذِينَ تَمَنَّوْا مَكَانَهُ بِالْأَمْسِ يَقُولُونَ وَكَأَنَّ اللَّهَ يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيَقْدِرُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. They said وَيْكَأَنَّ. How do you describe وَيْكَأَنَّ? What is وَيْكَأَنَّ? I don't know what Waykan is. Um, I guess, oh, how Allah, right? وَيْكَأَنَّ اللَّهَ يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقَ, which means gives provision to whomever He wills of His servants and restricts it, right? He gives and He restricts. So everything belongs in the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so essentially this is what they realized. طيب. So what is it that we can learn quickly from this story of Qarun? So we can move to the death of Musa and Harun, and then the last one is Ashab al-Sabt. Yes, Shaykh. Is a what? Another ayah, yes. Okay. Okay. So it's a sign for Bani Israel. طيب. So it's a sign for Bani Israel. Let's look at the details a bit more. It's a sign. And it's trying to teach them something, obviously. Right? Especially when you talk about the two different categories. The one that were mesmerized by the wealth. Right? But also him as an individual. So anybody that has wealth, they should not behave like Qarun. Remember the advice that they gave him. They said, وَابْتَغِي فِي مَا أَتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ, and seek what Allah has given you the hereafter. Right? So this tells us that we have to understand that wealth in itself is not necessarily a bounty. Like wealth itself is not a bounty. It is a test of how we utilize it. And it's meant to be as a means to an end. Right? It's not the end itself. Unfortunately, most people, when they work, they want to acquire money to acquire wealth. That's it. I'm just working for the money. But wealth is meant to be a means. A means to what, essentially? Any sort of blessing that you have should be a means to bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This entire, whatever we have in this world is supposed to be a means that would get us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what it's supposed to be. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَنَبْلُوكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ fitna. We test you with shar, which is bad, wal-khair, which is good, fitna, a tribulation and a test. Right? So in the case of Qarun, it actually led him to become a tyrant. Right? It didn't make him closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It let him become a tyrant because he misunderstood why he has this wealth. He thought it's because he deserved it. It's not because he was supposed to utilize it in getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, Shaykh. But that's why I said it's a test. طيب. You know, some people ask, which is harder, right? You know, because it's a test. Both are tests, right? Whether you are deprived of wealth or whether you have wealth, they both are a test. But which one is the more difficult? Why? We're not talking about the history of Jews. This is the nature of human beings, Sheikh. I know, but even just it's a. Now remember, this is not a lesson for Bani Israel only. This is a lesson for us. Yeah, Sheikh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us the story in the Quran, so we would learn from it. If they became Muslims, they will benefit. طيب, Sheikh, somebody can argue with the Christians. They invented capitalism. When Mulhideen, they invented communism. They wanted to acquire everything. Yes, Sheikh. Yes, Sheikh. Yeah, Shabab. Yes. Abu Abdullah. Can't hear you. Okay, so remember, I'm going back to the question, which is more difficult, the test of wealth or the test of poverty? Right, the test of wealth or test of poverty? The test of blessings or deprivation of the blessings, essentially. So there is a debate between the scholars, but I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. It might have been Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. So he mentioned that the test of of prosperity, right, is more difficult than the test of deprivation. Because when you're deprived, there's nothing you can do but be patient, right? But the test of prosperity, you have, it's easy for you, it's there. What is preventing you from acting on it, right? He said the example of that. He gave a very beautiful example. If I remember correctly, if it's Al-Ghazali, if not, then I apologize. He gave the example. He said, it's easier to be patient with hunger when you don't have food, right? As opposed to being patient with hunger when you have an entire buffet of the most delicious food in front of you, right? Deprived, blessing, right? So if you have a buffet of delicious food in front of you and you're hungry, it becomes much more difficult to be patient and not indulging. As opposed to it not being there in the first place, you don't have any food, and you're hungry, you're more likely to be patient. It becomes easier for you, Allah, right? So this is, I guess that's the answer to that question. Yes? Once again, Sheikh, they're both tests. But I'm talking about which one is more difficult. Which one is more difficult? When you have the means, control becomes more difficult. When you don't have it, there's nothing to do but be patient. Huh? طيب, but I'm just saying, طيب, you work as much as you want. You either have it or you don't, in the end. صح? People work hundreds of hours and they're still poor. They work 400 hours. It's not about the work, it's about you being patient with it, which is a harder test. Once again, it's a difference between opinions between the scholars, which is harder, being deprived of something as a test, or having the bounty, right? Which is more, easy, right? Is it a person whose vision, whatever, it's anything that you have, right? Including, for example, your eyes, right? A person who is half blind, are they are they more patient with not seeing, or the person who lowers his gaze from things that are haram? Right? It's just simple things. Sometimes, once again, when things become facilitated and easier for you, it becomes more of a challenge to overcome it. And so we have to realize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses the test that we have, but we have to understand, just because we have a blessing and a bounty, don't take it for granted. It is a test, still is a test. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us with the good and the bad. طيب. Yes, Sheikh.
From the sound, the story, where was
Musa?
that time?
طيب, Allah didn't want to mention them.
Not in the same area at that time.
Wallah, Sheikh, take this up with the mufassirin.
No, I'm saying that.
I know, I understand, but that's so.
Maybe they were like some.
No, not necessarily. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mention them. He didn't need to mention them. Khalas. It doesn't mean that they're not there. Just Allah didn't have to mention them. It didn't mean they didn't tell them not to do this. They didn't advise them. Allah alam, not necessarily. Allah chose to mention how the people advised them and how they didn't. But also perhaps it's because more important is to understand that the people, when it comes to wealth, they divide into different groups. Right? People will naturally, when it comes to wealth, will divide into different groups. That includes Muslims, by the way. Essentially, we're talking about Muslims, right? So Muslims, essentially, generally speaking, Muslims will fall into the two categories, that we, when they see those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given worldly gains, right? The first category, the ones that become mesmerized and they wish they had it, right? Like Bani Israel. Exactly. So those have fallen into two mistakes, essentially, right? So this you have to remember. When we see somebody who has wealth and we wish we had something like them, of course, the caveat is, if our intention is to have like them so we can spend in zakah and sadaqat, that is good. But most of the time, it's people want the wealth because they want the wealth. They want to enjoy life like they're enjoying life, right? So those who wish that have fallen into two mistakes. One is they're not content with what Allah gave them. They're not content with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them. And this is why the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as narrated by Abu Hurairah anhu, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Anzuru ila man huwa asfala minkum wa la tanzuru ila man huwa fawqakum." Look at those who are less than you. Don't look at those who are above you. Why? فهو أجدر ألا تزدروا نعمة الله عليكم. It is more likely that you do not belittle the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon you. right? So that's the first mistake. They were not content with what they have. The second is that they had a misconception of what true fortune is. True fortune is not necessarily wealth. True fortune is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided you to become the best Muslim you can in whatever situation you're in. That is a person who is fortunate, right? You know, they usually talk about, like, karamat, which is blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives His righteous servants. They said the best, like the best karama or the greatest karama is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects you from falling to sin. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made you a Muslim and keeps you on that path. That is the greatest karama from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And so essentially that is what true fortune is. That Allah subhanahu, no matter whether you have, the money or you don't, that you are on that path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and it does not move you away from it. So that's the first category, right? The people, the lesson that we learn is, that's why we mentioned, the two, perhaps the wisdom mentioning the people rather than mentioning Musa and Harun, is that those individuals themselves, they react into different ways, and we learn from that. The second category are those who know the true scale of things, right? The reality of what is important, and not be fooled by the external appearances, but know what matters in the end is the hereafter. Right? It doesn't matter how wealthy you are, how good you are, or how well you're doing. It's what you're doing with it. Right? Are you abiding by the orders of Allah Ta'ala, or are you not? This is why, even at the time of some of the pious predecessors, some of the scholars and the worshippers, they would say that if the kings would have known the na'im, the blessings that we live in, they would have fought it over us. We're talking about people who are not rich, but they were so content with what they had. They're so happy because of their content with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they actually had happiness in this world. And they said if the kings knew what we had, they would fight us over it. Right? And so perhaps that's another lesson we can learn. طيب, I'm just mentioning two quick lessons so we can, what time is Isha? 10 o'clock. طيب. So just two lessons. One is that we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this world to whomever He loves and who He doesn't. Allah gives this world to whomever He loves and He doesn't. In fact, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala valued this world, He would not have given it to the disbeliever. Right? Not even a sip of water. But the reality is this world means nothing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is meant there for a reason, and it's a test. Wallahu a'lam. So that's why He gives it to whomever He pleases. And because it's a test, essentially it's a test, and not necessarily a reward, so it doesn't indicate whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with the person or not. And in better indication if Allah is pleased with the person or not is whether He directs that person to utilize what he has in His pleasure or not. Essentially. Wallahu a'lam. The last one is taking from the advice that Bani Israel had given to Qarun, is that the correct way to handle the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The correct way to handle the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, to direct it towards the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? To direct, even including our intentions when we acquired what we're doing it for, towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and make our goal essentially to attain the hereafter, right? That is essentially the lesson we learned from it. But also the importance of being humble towards the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you notice, Qarun over here was pretty arrogant, right? That's why he went to that parade. So we learn from that the importance of being humble. And if you compare that with Uthman radiallahu anhu, for example, who was very wealthy. He was not like that, right? He was very humble radiallahu anhu, even though he was considered one of the most wealthy companions radiallahu anhum. But also, last lesson I'm going to mention over here is that submitting to the truth and performing righteous deeds is important, right? It's the opposite of arrogance. Arrogance is when you reject the truth, right, and you put down the people. So over here, the problem with Qarun is that even though his people were giving him the correct advice, he was too arrogant to accept it, right? And so submitting to the truth is important. Whenever we see the truth, we take it, we accept it, rather than being arrogant and rejecting it. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. What are we going to talk about now? The death of Musa and Harun. طيب. So I remember actually I had mentioned that I would only mention things that are mentioned in the Quran. Obviously the Quran did not mention the death of Harun and Musa alayhi salam. But I felt like the story would not be complete without it. And so what we have are some of the narrations that were mentioned regarding Harun and Musa alayhi salam. Now, what's agreed upon is that both, or as the majority of scholars are of the opinion, is that both Musa and Harun died during the time where Bani Israel was still lost, were still lost. So they were still in the T, which means that they were still lost because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had prohibited them from entering Al-Maqdis for 40 years. And so in that 40 years, within that 40 years span, Musa and Harun, both of them, had died. And it's mentioned that Harun had died a few years before Musa alayhi salam. Right? Now, those are mentioned in some narrations. So the narration of the death of Harun alayhi salam was mentioned in Mustadrak al-Hakim, and he said it's a good standing. He said, like, the chain is a good standing of people who both the Bukhari and Muslim narrated for. There's a debate some of the authenticity. It was mentioned in the Isra'iliyat, so they kind of corroborate this narration a little bit. But nonetheless, there is no, there's nothing we need to build on in terms of belief or fiqh, but it's just a story we can kind of understand to how, just to conclude the story. And so this one, it was mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of Harun's death, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to Musa alayhi salam that he was going to take the life of Harun. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to Musa that he was going to take the life of Harun, and he had ordered him to take him to a specific mountain, like a valley between between two big mountains. There's a valley between them. He said, take him there. And so Musa alayhi salam took Harun towards that, towards that area. Once they reached that, all of a sudden they found a tree that they've never seen something like it. Right? They've seen a tree, they've never seen something like it. And they saw a house that was built there. And so they entered, and they entered this. They couldn't find anybody. There's nobody there inhabiting it. And so they went in, and they found a bed that has a mattress and beddings and everything in it, and it has a very beautiful scent. There's like a rih tayyiba, right? A very beautiful scent associated with it. And so when Harun looked at the mountain and the house and what's in it, he was very a'jabahu, which means he was fascinated by it, right? He liked it. And so he told Musa, I would love to sleep, right, on that bed. Right? You have to remember, they're lost for 40 years, right? He said, I would love to sleep on that bed. And so Musa alayhi salam told him, sleep on it. And so he told Musa alayhi salam, he said, I'm afraid that the Lord of this house would come and be angry with me. Because you walk in, there's people sleeping in your house, right? Goldilocks and the 3 bears. You know that story? Type. Apparently there's different dimensions to that story, but anyway. And so once he told that to Musa alayhi salam told him, no, don't be afraid, don't worry. I will, ana akfik, right? Ana akfika rabb al-bayt. I will, suffice you from the Lord of the house. And so, sleep. And so he told to Musa, sleep with me, right? So they lied in the bed and they fell asleep. And so then Harun passed away. Right? Harun passed away. This was the time where he's going to pass. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala essentially wanted to take him that way. And so once he passed away, that house, disappeared, right? And that tree disappeared, and the bed was elevated to the heavens. And then Musa returned back to Bani Israel, obviously without Harun. And so Mustadrak al-Hakim narration, it says, when Musa went back to his people, and they saw, he went with his brother, but he came back by himself, and so they assumed what happened, that he killed his brother. Right? So they assumed they killed his brother, and they accused Musa alayhi salam of killing his brother out of jealousy, right? Because they said that, they said that we loved your brother more than you, and so you were jealous, and so you killed him, right? Because Harun was the more lenient with them. Musa alayhi salam was the harsher and stricter person with them. Musa was more lenient, and so they loved Harun essentially more. And so they said, because of that, you were jealous, and you killed him. Right? And so once he started, seeing what's happening and stuff like that, he essentially scolded them. He said, do you think I would kill my brother? Right? And so they still continued. And so, Allah subhanahu, Musa alayhi salam, he prayed 2 rak'ahs, and he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reveal the truth. And so the narration mentions that the bed came down with Harun in it, and from the heavens with Harun essentially dead on it. And when they saw it, they realized he was saying the truth, right? But it's kind of interesting how fast they are to blame a prophet, accuse a prophet. This tells you the deficiency in their belief of prophets. As Muslims, we believe that prophets are infallible. And that's very important. They're infallible in everything, in character and in the message that they deliver. Because, and let me tell you why, explain why this is important. It's important because it reflects the credibility of the prophets. If there's anything that would touch the credibility of a prophet, it's grounds for us not to believe them. Does it make sense? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them from before they became prophets. Quite often He protects them from committing any sort of major sins, right? Majority of scholars also believe even minor sins. When they would try to engage in things that the youth would engage in, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would stop them one way or another. None of the prophets ever worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They never worshipped idols. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected their credibility. They were all trustworthy, they were all honest. This is why nobody was able to accuse them of lying. Now, over here, the belief of Bani Israel is distorted. Heavily distorted, right? That they would accuse, and this is not the first time, right? They would accuse prophets of doing a lot of, hideous things, and in fact, they would want to kill them quite often. And so they accused Musa alayhi salam of jealousy, right? But then also killing a human being, which is one of the worst things that would ever happen, right? To kill his brother. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to them the truth. So this was the death of Harun. And it was mentioned in some of the narrations that Harun had died when he was 180 years old, right? Some narrations say it was actually 130 years old, and that he died 3 years prior to the death of Musa alayhi salam. He died 3 years prior to the death of Musa alayhi salam. Now, as for the death of Musa alayhi salam, the story was mentioned was Sahih Bukhari, right? And this is the story of the angel of death when it came to Musa alayhi salam. And so the angel of death, Abu Hurairah had mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ said that the angel of death was sent to Musa alayhi salam. And so when he came to him, Musa alayhi salam struck him. Other narrations clarify, right, why he struck him, because he told him, Ajib Rabbak, right? Essentially it's a form of, when somebody says that statement, essentially tells them, it can be interpreted as, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to take your life. Respond to your Lord, your soul is going to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it seemed that this person showed up all of a sudden in Musa alayhi salam's house. So you can imagine the situation, a person showing up in your house and saying, you get ready to meet your Lord. What are you going to do? What did you say? Modern time, he was going to shoot him, obviously, right? But it's grounds for, don't get him a guns license issue. But technically, within the boundaries of the law of this land, you are allowed to, protect your house and hold, whatever is necessary. But essentially what he did was Musa alayhi salam struck him, and essentially, فَقَعَ عَيْنَيْهِ, he damaged the eye of that angel because he came in the form of a human being, right? So he came in the form of a human being, and so he struck him and damaged his eye. And it's kind of interesting, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, whomever spies into your house, if somebody's trying to spy into your house, they said, puncture his eye, because they're not supposed to do that anyway. But essentially this is what happened. And so Jibreel alayhi salam, or the angel of death, went back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he told him, you sent me to a servant that doesn't want to die. But you have to understand what happened. Musa alayhi salam did not know this was the angel of death. It's the same thing when a person came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asked him about Islam, asked him about Iman. The Prophet ﷺ did not know he's an angel. Later on, he was revealed to him as an angel. Disagree as much as you want, Yusuf. Sabran jamilan. He did not know Jibreel alayhi salam. Let me tell you why. Because the hadith says what? The different narrations. The Prophet ﷺ didn't tell them immediately that was Jibreel. That was a few days later. Mali, it was a few days later. A few days later. Why did it take a few days later? Because it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ that this was Jibreel. Yes, Shaykh. Yeah, it happened a lot. So when the angels came to Ibrahim alayhi salam, when the angels came to Lut alayhi salam, so when they came, like, why if Ibrahim alayhi salam knew those were angels, why would he sacrifice an animal for them to feed them? Does that make sense? طيب, ma this guy came to Musa alayhi salam in the form of a human being. He came in the form of a human being. He did not know immediately that he's an angel. The same to how they came to Ibrahim in the form of human beings, same to how they came to Lut alayhi salam in the form of human beings. No. Yeah, no. They described him. The different narration says, فَلَبِثَ مَلِيًّا. Another narration said that he called me after a few days. So they all indicate that these happened, he told Umar ibn Khattab a few days later. Why didn't he tell them immediately? Right? There's a reason for that, Shaykh. Right? But in any case, hatta even with the Prophet ﷺ, there's precedence in the Quran that angels come in the form of human beings and the Prophets don't know who they are. Right? It's not strange. Even if they're prophets, if he comes in the form of human beings, they would not know that this is an angel unless Allah tells them or unless they tell them. Inna Rasula Rabbika. Right? Inna Rasula Rabbika. Right? When they came to Ibrahim alayhi salam, they said, Inna ursilna ila qawmi Lut. He did not know. And then when they came to Lut alayhi salam, they came in a certain image. He tried to protect them from the people. He said, and they said, don't worry, we're the messengers of your Lord. He didn't know. And so in this case, Ibrahim alayhi salam, or Musa alayhi salam, the reason he hit this person was because this was a random person that showed up in his house, and he said, Ajib Rabbak, essentially, your soul's going to come. He did not know. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent him again, right? And he told him, he said, irji' alayhi faqul, so tell Musa alayhi salam to put his hand on a thawr, which is a bull, and whatever amount of hairs his hand is upon, then for that hair he has a year to live further. And so when this happened, Musa alayhi salam asked him, then what? He said, then you die. He said, then now. So this tells you that Musa alayhi salam is not objecting to death. No prophet objects to death, ya Shaykh. But it seemed that this person came in a way that threatened him, and he'll protect himself. Is that clear? Ya Shaykh Nasr. Yes. Yes. Because this is how they used to come. Now, some of the scholars said after that. I understand, ya Sheikh, but that prophet is still a human being, and he sees another human being. So when he comes in the form of a human being, he'll see him as a human being. He doesn't see him as an angel. When the angels come in the form of a human being, they are in the form of a human being. So you see them as a human being. You cannot differentiate. He did not come in the form of a human. Why do you think he came in the form of a human, Sheikh? Nobody said he came in the form of a human. He did not come to the form of a human being. He came in the form of an angel, and he informed him. He said, Allah is giving you a choice, right? Either to meet him, or he can give you, become a king and a prophet and stay. So he said, بِرَفِيقٍ الْأَعْلَى, right? Had a what? It doesn't matter. No, by that time. So, human being, natural form, therefore original form. That's why. Wallah a'lam. What time do you have left? I really wanted to finish today, Sheikh. طيب, we have أصحاب السبت. I think we're going to have to leave that. Huh? Shay can wait? I don't know, Sheikh Saraj will not be very happy. Oh, you think it's not a long story? You think it's not a long story? طيب. I guess we can because essentially Ashab al-Sabt, it happened after they went into Palestine. Right? And so there's this whole thing before they go in there, and there's a few verses. So I wanted to take that from the beginning. So the Prophet ﷺ told us where it is. So Musa actually, which reminds me. So Musa ﷺ, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take him away from Al-Quds biramit hajar, like Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. So you can land as a far distance, and when you throw a rock, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, if I wanted, I would show you where he is. But Bani Israel didn't know where Musa ﷺ was buried or where Harun was buried. There's another narration that indicates why that they don't know where Musa ﷺ was buried. That it was mentioned, like, I can't remember the strength of the narration, but it was mentioned that Musa ﷺ was walking and he saw angels digging. This time he saw angels digging, right, a grave, and it was such a beautiful grave, and they did such a beautiful job with it. And he said, "Who's this for?" He said, "It's for a special servant for Allah subhanahu wa taala." Right? He said, like, I wish I had one like this. He said, "Well, if you want, you can lie in it." And he lied in it, and this is where he died, and they buried him. And the reason we know that Bani Israel don't know the location of their grave is because if they did, what would happen? They would worship them, right? They would build temples and worship on them. And so we know for sure they don't know. We might know the area, like the general area, but we don't know where they got buried. Wallahu a'lam. Type. I think we're going to have to leave Ashab al-Sabt some other time. لا, we talked about that, يا شيخ. فألقى الألواح من يده وأخذ برأس أخيه يجره. No, why would he be buried? But you have to. It doesn't have to be buried. There was no mention to it. Was it buried or not buried? But if he was buried, khalas is buried. But most likely not, because it's information and knowledge that Bani Israel needs to practice on, right? But we know that even if they had it, it got corrupted over time. لا. Baqiya is not. It has nothing to do with alwah. Just remnants of whether clothing or whatever, like belongings that they have, is not talking about the alwah at all. Wallahu a'lam. We'll talk about that later, inshallah. When we talk about وَقَتَلَ دَاوُودُ جَالُوتَ. Actually, I should figure out which should we take. So after Ashab al-Sabt, I'm wondering if we should take. We haven't talked about Shu'aib. So there's several people that the Prophet Musa had met and was with them. So we have Shu'aib. We haven't mentioned his story. And then we have Yusha. He's the one essentially that led Bani Israel to Bayt al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. And so we might have these two stories to kind of talk about, inshallah. Sounds good? جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.